The cash on the floor. The lobby of First Capital Bank was busy that afternoon. The sound of printers clicking, keyboards tapping, and quiet conversations filled the air. Sunlight poured through tall glass windows, reflecting off polished marble floors. Customers waited in neat rows of chairs, some scrolling through their phones, others checking watches. In the middle of the line stood a woman in a plain gray blazer and simple flats. She looked ordinary at first glance. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and she carried a large brown envelope under her arm. No one gave her a second look, and that was exactly how she preferred it. Her name was Zara Caldwell. To the world of business and finance, she was a giant, one of the most powerful black female CEOs in the country. She commanded a billion-dollar tech empire, led international partnerships, and had recently closed a deal valued at over $2 billion. Yet here, in the lobby of a downtown bank, she looked like anyone else, and that was her weapon. When she reached the counter, a teller with perfectly manicured nails and a sharp smile greeted her. Her name tag read, Belle. The smile she gave Zara was not friendly. It was the kind of smile people gave when they thought they were in control. Yes, Belle asked, her tone already clipped. I'd like to deposit these, Zara said calmly, sliding the envelope forward. Belle opened it. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of neat stacks of $100 bills, $20,000 in total, but instead of being impressed, her lips curled into something cruel. Well, well, she said loudly enough for others in line to hear. That's quite a lot of cash for someone like you. Zara's eyes flicked up, but her face remained composed. She had heard that tone 1,000 times in her life. Dismissive, mocking. The assumption that because she was a black woman, modestly dressed, she could not possibly be important. Before Zara could respond, Belle made her move. With a flick of her hand, she turned the envelope over, and the bills spilled across the counter and fell onto the marble floor. Gasps rippled through the lobby, the crisp bills scattered like leaves in the wind fanning out at Zara's feet. Oh no, Belle said, her voice dripping with false innocence. Clumsy me. She didn't bend down to help. Instead, she leaned back in her chair and watched, a smirk playing at her lips. A few staff members at the other counters hid their laughter behind their hands. Customers whispered. Some even chuckled openly. Zara slowly bent down. Her knees touched the cold marble as she began collecting the money bill by bill with steady hands. Each piece of paper seemed to carry more weight than its dollar value. She had been here before, not this bank, not this exact moment, but this kind of humiliation. She had felt it as a young woman starting out, as a business leader underestimated by boardrooms full of men, as a black entrepreneur dismissed before she even opened her mouth. But Zara Caldwell had learned something long ago. Anger was loud, but silence was sharper. She gathered the final bill, stacked the money neatly again, and placed it back on the counter. Then she looked up at Belle. Her face was calm, unreadable. Deposit it, she said simply. Belle scoffed. Of course. She handled the bills as though they were dirty, tapping them into the machine with exaggerated motions. The bank lobby buzzed again, though now in hushed tones. People looked at Zara differently, some with pity, some with quiet admiration, but most with ignorance. They saw only what Belle saw, a modest woman embarrassed on a marble floor. What none of them saw was the storm already gathering behind Zara's calm eyes. When the receipt finally printed, Belle slid it across the counter without meeting her gaze. Zara picked it up, nodded once, and turned to leave. She didn't shout, she didn't argue, she didn't even scold. She walked out of the bank with the same steady pace she had walked in. But inside, a decision had already been made. By the next morning, First Capital Bank would realize the cost of its arrogance. The teller who thought herself clever, the managers who ignored what happened, the executives who never trained their staff to look past prejudice, they would all learn that sometimes the most dangerous sound is not a raised voice, it is silence. The return. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of morning when the city seemed to hum with restless energy. At First Capital Bank, the staff went about their routines with little thought to the events of the previous day. To them, the incident with the woman in the gray blazer had been nothing more than an amusing story to share over coffee, a harmless humiliation inflicted on a customer who had dared to walk in with too much cash and too little status. Belle, the teller at the center of it, had laughed about it with her colleagues in the break room, her voice dripping with satisfaction as she retold how the woman had bent to the floor, gathering bills like a beggar scraping for scraps. None of them knew her name. None of them cared. But while the staff continued with their shallow gossip, the city outside moved differently. In the financial district, whispers traveled through boardrooms, executive offices, and across trading floors. A single decision, made in silence by Zara Caldwell the night before, had set into motion a chain of calls, meetings, and urgent memos that were already rippling toward First Capital Bank like a silent tidal wave. She had not shouted, she had not threatened, but in the span of a few hours she had pulled back signatures, canceled transfers, and instructed her partners to freeze dealings tied to the bank. A $2 billion deal that was supposed to be finalized within days was suddenly in jeopardy, though the executives at First Capital didn't yet know why. When the black electric car glided into the parking lot of the bank that morning, its sleek body gleaming beneath the rising sun, no one in the lobby connected it to the quiet woman they had mocked the day before. The car door opened with a soft click and Zara stepped out, her movements unhurried yet precise. She was dressed differently now. No modest blazer, no plain shoes. She wore a fitted black suit cut with quiet elegance paired with polished heels that struck the pavement with purpose. A slim leather briefcase rested in her hand. To the casual eye she was still understated, but there was no mistaking the aura she carried. It was the presence of someone accustomed to commanding rooms where billions were negotiated and the fate of corporations decided. Inside the bank, Belle was again at her station. When Zara entered, conversations stuttered and slowed as though the air had thickened. People glanced at her, some recognizing her from yesterday, but failing to understand why the sight of her seemed different now. Belle straightened in her chair, her smirk tugging at her lips as she remembered her little display from the day before. She was preparing for another chance to assert her petty power, but what she did not realize was that the ground beneath her feet had already shifted. Zara did not approach Belle's counter. Instead, she walked directly past the line of tellers, her heels clicking against the marble, and stopped in front of the frosted glass door marked Branch Manager. She knocked once, firmly, and entered without waiting for an answer. The branch manager, a balding man in his 50s named Gregory Hale, looked up in irritation at the intrusion. "Excuse me, ma'am, you can't just—" His voice faltered as Zara set her briefcase on his desk and opened it with a quiet snap. Quiet snap. From inside, she drew a set of documents, crisp and bound, stamped with the insignia of Caldwell Technologies and its global partners. She placed them in front of him without a word. Gregory frowned, scanning the titles. His face drained of color as recognition dawned. These were contracts tied to the bank's most lucrative partnership in years. Contracts they had been celebrating internally for weeks. Contracts now bearing fresh ink across the signature lines where Zara Caldwell's name should have been. Except the signatures were gone, rescinded. "I came here yesterday," Zara said, her voice even, every word deliberate, "and one of your employees thought it amusing to scatter my money on the floor. A small thing, yes, but disrespect, Mr. Hale, has a price." Gregory stammered, his throat dry. You're Caldwell? Ms. Caldwell?" Zara's eyes did not waver. "I was, until yesterday. Today I am a woman who chooses where her empire places its trust, and First Capital Bank has lost that trust." As she closed the briefcase and stood to leave, Gregory scrambled to his feet, his palms damp with panic. The $2 billion partnership was the cornerstone of the bank's expansion strategy, the deal that would have cemented their influence in the global market. Without it, the ripple effects would devastate not only their stock value but their reputation across the industry. And it had slipped through his fingers overnight, all because his staff had mistaken dignity for weakness. In the lobby, Belle was still smirking, unaware that her petty cruelty had just cost her employer billions. She had no idea that by noon, the headlines would begin to appear, and the executives upstairs would be calling for her name, demanding answers, demanding accountability. Zara walked out the same way she had walked in, calm, steady, silent. But now the silence was heavier, sharper, filled with a way the bank would not soon forget. By the time the first article appeared online, declaring the collapse of the First Capital Caldwell partnership, it was already too late. And the storm Zara Caldwell had unleashed was only just beginning. The headlines: by mid-morning, the first tremors reached the lobby of First Capital Bank. At first, it was just a handful of phone calls to the manager's office, but then the calls multiplied, spilling into every department. Executives who had walked into the building with smiles only hours earlier were now pacing their offices with white-knuckled grips on their phones. Screens flickered in meeting rooms, displaying breaking news alerts that no one inside the bank had expected to see. On the largest financial news networks, bold red banners scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Caldwell Technologies terminates 2-buy partnership with First Capital Bank. The words looked surreal, even to those who had been warned of the possibility just moments before. Anchor desks replayed clips of Zara Caldwell at global conferences, shaking hands with world leaders, speaking on stages about innovation and equality, photographed beside CEOs who had built empires alongside her. To the average viewer, she was a respected business icon, but to the executives at First Capital, she was now a nightmare personified, a single figure powerful enough to topple months of careful planning with a quiet stroke of her pen. Downstairs in the branch lobby, customers scrolled on their phones, whispering in growing tones of surprise. "Isn't that our bank?" one woman murmured, turning her screen so the man beside her could see. $2 billion. Gone? The news spread like wildfire, fueled by social media. Twitter hashtags blazed with outrage and fascination. TikTok clips stitched together Zara's past speeches about dignity and resilience, while commentator has pointed out that this was a direct response to an incident inside one of First Capital's own branches. Inside the break room, Belle sat with her usual group, laughing at some half-hearted joke one of her co-workers had made, when her phone buzzed with a notification. She glanced at the headline, her smile faltering. For a brief moment she thought it must be coincidence. After all, Caldwell was a common enough name, wasn't it? But when she opened the article, the accompanying photo froze her in place. It was the woman from yesterday. The same woman she had humiliated, the one who had bent silently to the floor as bills scattered at her feet, was there on her screen. Only this time Zara Caldwell was not dressed in a plain gray blazer. She stood behind a podium, cameras flashing, surrounded by the gleaming logos of international corporations. The caption beneath the photo made Belle's blood run cold. Zara Caldwell, CEO of Caldwell Technologies, ends $2 deal with First Capital Bank following internal incident. Her co-workers leaned over her shoulder, gasping audibly. The break room went silent. What? What incident? Someone whispered. Belle's face drained of color. She wanted to laugh it off, to pretend she had no idea, but the memory of her own smirk, her deliberate gesture, the bills fluttering onto the marble floor, all of it replayed in her mind with brutal clarity. She remembered the quiet way Zara had looked at her, the stillness in her face, the calm that now seemed terrifying in hindsight. Belle had thought she was just another powerless woman she could demean without consequence. Now the realization pressed down on her chest like a weight she could not escape. Her petty act had cost the bank billions. Upstairs, the executives were no calmer. Gregory Hale, the branch manager, was called into a video conference with senior leadership. Their voices rose in sharp panic as they demanded explanations. How had this happened? How had a single customer encounter spiraled into a full-blown corporate disaster? Gregory stammered, his hands trembling, before admitting the truth, that Zara Caldwell had been humiliated inside his branch. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then came the rage. "Do you understand what you've done?" a vice president barked through the screen. "Do you understand what this means for our investors, our shareholders, our reputation? $2 billion evaporated overnight because of arrogance and incompetence." Gregory swallowed hard, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He knew the blame would not stop at him. It would travel down to the lobby, to the counter, to the teller who had caused the humiliation in the first place. And in that moment, he could already see Belle's smirk, her mocking eyes, her careless cruelty. He knew her career was already finished. But the damage was larger than a single employee. Stock prices began to dip before noon as analysts dissected the fallout live on air. Rival banks pounced on the opportunity, reaching out to Caldwell Technologies with offers of partnerships, their spokespeople quick to frame themselves as more inclusive, respectful, and aligned with modern values. The narrative spun beyond control. First Capital Bank was no longer a proud institution. It was now a symbol of arrogance, prejudice, and downfall. Back in the lobby, Belle finally stood from her chair, her legs unsteady. For the first time since yesterday, the smirk was gone. The whispers of customers had changed too. They weren't laughing anymore. They were pointing, murmuring, and sharing glances filled with something Belle recognized instantly: contempt. She had thought she was the one in control. But now, she was the face of disgrace in the very building where she had once strutted with false pride. And all the while, Zara Caldwell remained silent. She had not spoken to the press. She had no... He issued a statement. Her absence only made the story more powerful. It was the silence of someone who had already moved on, leaving behind a crater so deep that those who caused it would never climb out. By the end of the day, as cameras gathered outside the bank and protesters began to hold signs calling for accountability, Belle finally understood what it meant to be truly humiliated. She had laughed when Zara's money hit the floor. Now the entire world was laughing at her, and the storm had only just begun. The reckoning. By the time the sun dipped low on the horizon, First Capital Bank was no longer just another financial institution. It had become the center of a firestorm. The building that once symbolized wealth and authority was now flanked by news vans, satellite dishes, and crowds of onlookers armed with smartphones. Every angle of the bank's glass facade was captured, dissected, and broadcast across the world. Protesters carried signs scrawled with bold letters: "Respect isn't optional, dignity matters, and fire the teller." It was no longer just about a $2 billion partnership. It had become a cultural moment, a mirror reflecting the consequences of arrogance and prejudice in the modern age. Inside the bank's upper offices, panic rippled through every floor. Shareholders were flooding phone lines demanding explanations for the collapse of a partnership that had been touted in press releases as the deal of the decade. Board members convened in emergency sessions, their voices raised in anger and disbelief. Some shouted for Gregory Hale's resignation, others wanted to see heads roll further down the chain. None of them wanted to admit the truth. The entire crisis had been sparked by a single act of cruelty in their own lobby, an act so small in their eyes that they would never have imagined it could destroy them. Yet here they were, watching billions evaporate while their stock value bled red across ticker screens. Gory Hale, the branch manager, sat in his office with his face buried in his hands. He had aged 10 years in a single day. His phone buzzed relentlessly with calls from superiors who had no interest in hearing excuses. He had begged for more time, pleaded that the bank could salvage the partnership if they reached out quickly. But even as he spoke, he knew it was useless. Zara Caldwell had already moved on, and her silence was louder than any statement. In her quiet refusal to engage, she had stripped the bank of control. They were scrambling to respond to a game that she alone had rewritten. Downstairs, Belle could no longer hide from the growing whispers. Customers came in not to deposit or withdraw, but to gawk, to film her at her station, to snap photos that would later circle the internet under hashtags like #BelleTheTeller and #CaldwellResponse. She tried to keep her chin high, but the eyes around her felt like daggers. Every movement, every fake smile, every word she spoke carried the weight of mockery. She knew now that she had become the face of this scandal, the symbol of everything wrong with the bank's culture. The irony was suffocating. Yesterday she had laughed at a woman on her knees, and today she was the one stripped of dignity, paraded before the world as a cautionary tale. Outside, the media pressed harder. Commentators on major networks replayed security footage leaked from inside the branch, the grainy clip showing bills scattering across the marble floor, as a silent Zara bent to gather them. The footage ignited fury. Talk shows framed it as a story about systemic prejudice, about arrogance and ignorance in institutions of power. Analysts explained how disrespect was not just a moral failure, but now a financial liability. The clip was replayed so often it burned itself into the public imagination. People who had never heard of First Capital Bank or Caldwell Technologies before now debated it passionately in their homes, offices, and classrooms. As night fell, the bank attempted damage control. A hastily written press release appeared on their website filled with hollow words. "We deeply regret the incident. We are committed to learning. Diversity and respect remain at the heart of our values." But the statement was shredded within minutes, mocked online as insincere and desperate. No apology could erase the humiliation Zara had endured, or the billions the bank had lost because of it. And then, finally, Zara Caldwell spoke. She did not call a press conference. She did not stage a dramatic television appearance. Instead, she posted a short message on her official company page, accompanied by a single photo of her standing outside her office tower, dressed in her signature black suit, her gaze steady and unyielding. The message was only 2 sentences long, but it hit like thunder across the digital world. Respect is not negotiable. When it is denied, so is partnership. The post was shared millions of times within hours. Influential figures from across industries applauded her restraint, praising her for delivering a lesson without resorting to anger. Activists framed her as a symbol of dignity and strength, while business leaders quietly studied her move, realizing that in an era where reputation was currency, she had just rewritten the playbook. For First Capital Bank, the consequences deepened overnight. By morning, calls for boycotts filled social media. Regulators announced inquiries into the bank's internal practices. Rival institutions gained market share as customers began closing accounts in droves, unwilling to align themselves with a brand now synonymous with arrogance and humiliation. Inside the bank, Gregory Hale knew his resignation was inevitable and Bell's dismissal was already being drafted, but none of it would undo the damage. Meanwhile, Zara Caldwell returned to her life as if nothing had happened. She attended meetings, reviewed projects, and moved her partnerships to institutions that valued her empire and her dignity in equal measure. The storm that consumed First Capital did not touch her, it only elevated her, proving that her silence was not weakness, but the sharpest weapon of all. The world watches. Within 48 hours, the scandal surrounding First Capital Bank was no longer a domestic embarrassment. It had become an international spectacle. Financial newspapers in London, Paris, and Tokyo ran front-page stories about the collapse of the $2 billion Caldwell partnership, framing it as a cautionary tale of arrogance colliding with dignity. Business analysts on European morning shows dissected the situation with sharp precision, noting that the loss was not merely financial, but symbolic. In a world increasingly driven by trust, reputation, and inclusivity, First Capital had managed to destroy all three in a single afternoon. Politicians weighed in, eager to align themselves with the tidal wave of public sentiment. In Washington, a senator gave an impassioned speech about the incident, framing it as a stark reminder of how prejudice still corrodes institutions at their core. When dignity is denied in the smallest interaction, she said, the consequences echo across entire systems. Her words went viral, quoted alongside Zara Caldwell's own statement. In London, a prominent member of parliament praised Caldwell Technologies for setting a global example, while in Africa and Asia, commentators spoke of Zara as a model of black excellence who had carried herself with unshakable composure in the face of humiliation. What had begun as a petty act in one bank branch was now shaping international conversations about respect, power, and accountability. Meanwhile, rival banks moved with lightning speed. Institutions that had once struggled to win Caldwell Technologies' attention were suddenly tripping over themselves to offer deals, sweeter terms, and global partnerships. One Swiss bank issued a press release within hours of the scandal breaking, announcing a new collaboration with Caldwell Technologies. Their stock soared overnight as investors recognized the symbolism. They had aligned themselves with dignity, while First Capital bled losses. In the corridors of global finance, the message was clear. Zara Caldwell was not just a CEO, she was a force that could shift markets with a single decision. Inside First Capital, the walls were closing in. The boardroom, once a sanctuary of polished suits and confident smiles, was now a war zone of shouting voices and trembling hands. Shareholders demanded resignations, regulators announced investigations, and reporters camped outside the headquarters with cameras rolling day and night. Gregory Hale, the branch manager who had once wielded quiet authority in his office, now found himself a scapegoat. The corporate ladder he had spent decades climbing had crumbled beneath him in less than a week. He was suspended pending internal review, though he knew what that meant. His career was over. But no one's downfall was as swift and brutal as Belle's. The teller who had once smirked with quiet cruelty at the counter was now plastered across the internet as a meme, her grainy face captured from leaked security footage and captioned with words like "to be smirk" and "the teller who sank a bank." Customers pointed at her on the street. Neighbors whispered. Strangers spat insults online, digging into her personal life, her old social media posts, her past jobs. She had become the face of arrogance, the embodiment of petty prejudice, and the weight of that realization bore down on her like an anchor. Her supervisor called her into a small office on the third day. The meeting was short and cold. Effective immediately, the supervisor said, sliding a termination letter across the desk. "You are dismissed from First Capital Bank. Your behavior has caused reputational damage to this institution." Belle tried to argue, her voice trembling, insisting that it had only been a mistake, that she had never meant for it to go this far. But her words carried no weight now. The bank needed a sacrifice to calm the storm, and she was the most obvious one. When Belle walked out of the building for the last time, the crowd outside recognized her instantly. Cameras flashed, microphones shoved forward, reporters barking questions that cut like knives. "Do you regret humiliating Zara Caldwell? Do you realize you cost your bank billions? What would you say to women who look up to her?" She pushed through the sea of voices, her head down, her face pale, but even in her silence, the world's judgment followed. She had thought she was powerful when she tossed $20,000 onto the floor. Now she could barely lift her eyes. And while First Capital Bank collapsed under the weight of its own arrogance, Zara Caldwell continued forward, untouched. She did not gloat, she did not taunt, she did not speak beyond her single, devastating statement. She simply moved her empire to stronger hands, signing deals with institutions that recognized her value and respected her presence. Every photograph of her entering or leaving a meeting, poised and unbothered, fueled the narrative that she had transformed humiliation into a global reckoning. For the world, Zara had become more than a CEO, she was a symbol. For First Capital Bank, she was the ghost that haunted every boardroom, every shareholder call, every financial report dripping red. For Belle, she was the reminder of a mistake so catastrophic it would define the rest of her life: the collapse. By the end of the first week, the scandal that had begun with the scattering of bills on a marble floor had reached into every corner of Belle's life. She had been terminated from the bank, of course, her career shredded in an instant, but the punishment did not stop at her employment. Neighbors who had once greeted her politely now looked at her with thinly veiled contempt. Parents at her children's school whispered in clusters, pulling their kids closer as she walked by. Even members of her own family, embarrassed by the flood of online attention, stopped answering her calls. She scrolled endlessly through social media, unable to look away from the avalanche of ridicule, each meme and headline reducing her to a caricature, the smirking teller who cost her employer $2 billion. Every comment, every joke, every venomous remark pressed deeper into her chest, suffocating her with the realization that she had become infamous not for success, but for cruelty. Inside her small apartment, Belle sat hunched on the couch, blinds drawn tight, clutching her phone like a lifeline she could not release. The television blared with yet another panel of commentators discussing the scandal. One spoke about systemic prejudice, another about corporate accountability, and finally one analyst summed it up with words that cut Belle to the bone. The face of this crisis is that teller. She humiliated a billionaire CEO and brought her bank to ruin. It is a reminder that arrogance at the lowest level can destroy an empire at the top. Belle threw the remote across the room, but the words had already burned into her. She was no longer just Belle. She was a cautionary tale, a symbol of ignorance that would live online forever. Meanwhile, First Capital Bank's executives scrambled like drowning men grasping at broken planks. Their stock continued to plummet. Regulators launched for investigations into their internal practices, and major investors abandoned ship. The board forced out Gregory Hale, the branch manager, issuing a carefully worded statement about accountability and cultural reform. But the sacrifice changed nothing. The damage was too deep, the rot too visible. Every attempt at damage control was mocked by the public and dissected by analysts who compared First Capital's hollow apologies to Zara Caldwell's devastating silence. And then, the silence ended. Zara Caldwell announced that she would deliver a keynote address at the Global Business and Ethics Forum in New York, an annual event streamed to millions worldwide. The announcement electrified the media. Would she finally name First Capital Bank directly? Would she call for boycotts? Or would she let her message carry a more universal weight? The anticipation grew as the date approached, the press framing it as the most important speech of her career. For Zara, it was not revenge. It was a lesson, a moment to carve her values into stone before the eyes of the world. The morning of the speech, Manhattan buzzed with unusual intensity. Streets were clogged with cars, sidewalks swelled with protesters and supporters alike, and the venue itself shimmered beneath bright lights and international flags. Inside, the air was electric with anticipation. CEOs, politicians, journalists, and students filled the vast auditorium, waiting to hear the words of a woman whose silence had already reshaped markets. Cameras perched on tripods captured every angle, broadcasting the moment to the globe. Back in her apartment, Belle watched the live stream on her laptop, her hands trembling as she clutched a coffee mug she had not touched. She told herself she didn't care, that she could just shut the screen and walk away. But she couldn't. She needed to hear it. She needed to know whether Zara would speak her name, whether the humiliation would be made eternal in front of millions. The thought twisted her stomach into knots. When Zara finally walked onto the stage, the room rose to its feet. She was dressed in her usual black suit, her presence commanding without effort, her eyes calm but piercing. She waited for the applause to fade, then began, her voice measured and steady, carrying a weight that demanded silence. Power, she said, is often measured in money, in influence, in control over markets. But true power reveals itself in smaller places, in how you greet a stranger, how you treat a customer, how you respect a human being who owes you nothing. A bank lost $2 billion not because of a bad investment, not because of market forces, but because respect was denied. One act of arrogance revealed everything they truly were, and in that moment, the world saw it too. The room was utterly silent, the audience hanging on every syllable. Zara did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her calm authority cut sharper than any anger ever could. She spoke of her own life, of being underestimated, dismissed, humiliated, and how each time she had chosen to turn prejudice into strength. She reminded the audience that institutions are not destroyed by outsiders, but by the arrogance they cultivate within. When respect is absent, she said, her voice echoing in the vast hall, trust collapses. And when trust collapses, no amount of money can save you. That is the truth the world must carry from this moment. The hall erupted into thunderous applause. Reporters, saddened, scrambled to transmit her words across the world. Headlines flashing within minutes. Respect is not negotiable, screamed the front page of every major paper. Stock markets responded instantly. Rival banks aligned with Caldwell Technologies saw their value soar, while First Capital's stock plunged even lower, cementing their fall. In her apartment, Belle closed the laptop and buried her face in her hands. The words had not named her, but they had condemned her all the same. She was the living embodiment of that arrogance, the proof of how a smirk and a cruel gesture could destroy an empire. She had thought she was untouchable. Now she was infamous forever. And as Zara left the stage, her image broadcast to millions, the world knew it had witnessed more than a speech. It had witnessed the burial of First Capital Bank's reputation and the ascension of Zara Caldwell as a voice for dignity on the global stage. The legacy. In the weeks that followed Zara Caldwell's speech, the world did not simply move on, it carried her words like a torch. Universities added her keynote to business ethics courses. Editorials quoted her lines as though they were scripture, using them to dissect the fragile balance between dignity and power. Young entrepreneurs shared her speech online as motivation, describing how she had turned humiliation into authority without once raising her voice. Even political leaders abroad invoked her example in their campaigns, drawing from the power of her restraint to frame visions of leadership rooted in respect. What had begun with scattered bills on a bank floor had blossomed into a global movement. First Capital Bank, meanwhile, staggered like a wounded beast. Their stock price continued its downward spiral, forcing mass layoffs across branches nationwide. Customers closed accounts in droves, unwilling to entrust their money to an institution, now synonymous with arrogance and prejudice. Rival banks absorbed their market share, each competing to position themselves as the anti-First Capital, promising cultural reform, inclusivity, and dignity for all. Within 6 months, First Capital announced a desperate merger with a smaller competitor, but by then the brand itself was radioactive. The name that had once stood proudly in glass and steel towers became a cautionary whisper, a story of hubris taught in lecture halls and MBA programs. The empire had not been toppled by recession, fraud, or cybercrime. It had been undone by arrogance at the counter, arrogance met with silence. For Belle, life became a relentless series of punishments she could neither fight nor escape. Stripped of her job and her reputation, she found herself blacklisted across the industry. Every application she submitted was quietly rejected once her name surfaced. Neighbors avoided her, former friends stopped returning her calls, and her family kept her at arm's length, unable to endure the shame that followed her like a shadow. Online, her face lived on in memes and hashtags, frozen forever in the moment of her smirk, a reminder to millions of how one act of disrespect could spiral into global ruin. She tried at first to fight back, posting statements online about being misunderstood, about the mistake being exaggerated, but each word was met with laughter, derision, or worse, with Zara's own quote pasted beneath it. Respect is not negotiable. Belle could not escape the truth. She had mocked a woman who quietly commanded billions, and now the weight of her arrogance was crushing her life piece by piece. Zara, on the other hand, thrived. Caldwell Technologies expanded partnerships across Europe, Asia, and Africa, choosing institutions that demonstrated not only financial strength, but cultural integrity. In interviews, she was calm, professional, and always forward-looking, never us. In stooping to gloat over First Capital's fall, the public adored her for it. She became a symbol of composure in a world often addicted to outrage. Her silence had proven more powerful than fury, her restraint more devastating than retaliation. And with each new partnership signed, she reinforced the unspoken lesson: dignity, once denied, cannot be bought back with apologies. Her employees, inspired by her stance, began calling it the Caldwell Principle. It spread through boardrooms and training manuals, condensed into one line: how you treat the least powerful reveals whether you deserve the most powerful. Banks, corporations, and even government agencies began referencing it in their policies, eager to avoid the fate that had befallen First Capital. Zara had not only rewritten her own narrative, she had reshaped the rules of the game itself. But perhaps the most telling contrast lay in the two women at the heart of it all. Belle sat alone in her apartment, curtains drawn, living on unemployment checks and fading savings, tormented by the knowledge that she had destroyed herself with a single cruel gesture. She had believed that power came from sneers and smirks, from reminding others of their supposed place. Now she was the one without place, erased from the very world she had once mocked others for belonging to. She could not walk into a bank, a cafe, or even a grocery store without wondering if someone recognized her, if someone would whisper her name as the woman who sank a bank. Her life had become a living punishment. Zara, meanwhile, stood taller than ever. Her empire grew, her influence deepened, and her legacy became cemented. Yet to those who knew her best, she remained unchanged, measured, deliberate, calm. She never spoke of Bell by name, never boasted about the downfall of First Capital. To her, the incident was simply another reminder of what she had always known. Respect was the foundation of every structure, and when that foundation cracked, the entire building collapsed. She had not swung a hammer or shouted in anger. She had simply stepped aside and let the collapse come under its own weight. Years later, when business schools taught the case of Caldwell versus First Capital, professors would remind their students of the two sentences that had reshaped global markets. Respect is not negotiable. When it is denied, so is partnership. They would point to Bell as the cautionary figure, and to Zara as the model of dignity. The students, wide-eyed, would nod, understanding the lesson but marveling at the simplicity of it. And somewhere, Bell would sit in her small apartment, watching the world move on without her, unable to erase the smirk that had rewritten history. Zara Caldwell, however, would walk into boardrooms and stages around the globe, her silence still sharper than any shout. Her composure a constant reminder that the greatest victories are often won not by noise, but by restraint. Thus, the legacy was sealed, not just of a bank destroyed or a teller ruined, but of a truth carved into the fabric of power itself. Respect is not negotiable, and when denied, the cost is everything.